Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. I've been sailing alone for most of my adult life, and I thought I knew everything the ocean could show me. I'd seen bioluminescent plankton turning night swells into liquid starlight, witnessed the strange calm that settles over the water during a solar eclipse, and even encountered a pod of whales that surfaced so close to my boat I could have touched them. But what I saw during a solo crossing from San Diego to Hawaii in August of 2021 was unlike anything I'd experienced in 30 years of deep water sailing. I was 4 days out from the coast, maybe 800 miles southwest of Los Angeles, sailing my 36-foot sloop through waters that were deeper than Mount Everest is tall. The wind had been light but steady, and I was making good time toward the Hawaiian Islands, following a route I'd sailed twice before. The weather was perfect, clear skies, gentle swells, the kind of conditions that make you remember why you love being alone on the ocean. It was around 10 p.m., and I was sitting in the cockpit checking my position on the GPS when I noticed something unusual in the water about 50 yards off my starboard bow. At first, I thought it might be another boat, maybe a fishing vessel running without lights, which isn't uncommon in international waters. But as I watched more carefully, I realized I was looking at a glow coming from beneath the surface of the water. The glow was green, bright enough to be clearly visible, but soft enough that it didn't hurt to look at directly. It appeared to be moving in the same direction I was heading, maintaining a steady distance from my boat. Initially, I assumed it was some kind of marine life, perhaps a large school of fish or a whale disturbing bioluminescent plankton. I'd seen similar phenomena before, though never quite so bright or so well defined. I changed course slightly to get a better look, adjusting my heading to bring the light closer to my boat. As I approached it, I could see that the glow was coming from something much larger than I had initially thought. It wasn't a school of fish or a single large animal. It was a structured light source, maybe 30 or 40 feet in diameter, moving through the water with purpose and direction. The light maintained its position relative to my boat as I sailed toward it, which should have been impossible if it was a natural phenomenon. Ocean currents, marine life, even large whales don't adjust their course to match a sailing vessel. Whatever was creating this glow was actively positioning itself in relation to my boat, keeping pace with my 6-knot speed while remaining at a consistent depth of maybe 20 or 30 feet below the surface. I tried to get a better view by leaning over the side rail and using a flashlight to penetrate the water, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the ocean long before it could reach the source of the green glow. The light from below was steady and uniform, with no visible beam or cone extending upward. It simply existed as a disk of pale green illumination moving silently through the dark water. After about 20 minutes of parallel travel, the light began to move closer to my boat. I could see it clearly now, a perfect circle of green radiance, maybe 40 feet in diameter, rising slowly toward the surface. As it ascended, the glow became brighter and more defined, and I started to make out what looked like a solid structure within the light, something dark and metallic that seemed to be the source of the illumination. When the object reached a depth of maybe 10 feet, it stopped rising and began to move directly beneath my hull. I could hear my depth sounder registering the object as it passed underneath, beeping rapidly as it detected something large in the water column below my keel. The green light was so bright now that it illuminated the underside of my boat, casting an eerie glow on the white fiberglass hull. I grabbed my camera and tried to photograph what I was seeing, but the images came out poorly, just dark water with a vague green tint that didn't capture the intensity or definition of what I was observing with my naked eyes. It was as if the light existed in a spectrum that cameras couldn't properly record, visible to human vision, but somehow beyond the range of electronic sensors. For about 10 minutes, the object remained directly beneath my boat, matching my speed exactly. I could feel a subtle vibration through the hull, not quite sound, but a physical sensation that suggested the object was generating some kind of energy field. The water around my boat took on an almost electric quality, and I noticed that the normal sounds of sailing, the splash of small waves against the hull, the creak of rigging in the wind, seemed muffled, as if the object was somehow dampening sound transmission. Then, without any warning, the light began to move forward, passing under my bow and emerging on the port side of my boat. As it moved away from beneath the hull, I got my clearest view of whatever was creating the illumination. It definitely wasn't biological. The shape was too geometric, too clearly manufactured. It looked like a large disc or saucer, maybe 40 feet across and perhaps 8 or 10 feet thick, with a smooth, dark surface that seemed to absorb light, except for the bright green glow emanating from its edges. The object moved away from my boat with increasing speed, descending as it traveled until the green light became a distant glow far below the surface. I watched it disappear into the depths, leaving me alone in the normal darkness of a Pacific night, wondering if I had imagined the entire encounter. But the evidence was there in my navigation equipment. My GPS showed that during the time the object had been beneath my boat, my speed had increased by almost 2 knots, despite no change in wind conditions. My depth sounder had recorded the passage of a large, solid object at varying depths. Even my compass had shown minor deviations during the encounter, as if the object was generating a magnetic field that interfered with my navigation instruments. I spent the rest of the night replaying the experience in my mind, trying to come up with rational explanations for what I had witnessed. Submarines don't glow with green light and don't travel at depths of 10 feet in open ocean. Military vessels don't typically operate without any kind of identification or communication. Marine life doesn't form perfect geometric shapes or generate uniform electromagnetic fields. The following morning, I tried contacting the Coast Guard on my radio to report the encounter, but I found myself struggling to find words that wouldn't make me sound like I was suffering from hallucinations or psychological breakdown. How do you report a UFO sighting from a sailboat in the middle of the Pacific without sounding like you've been alone at sea too long? In the end, I filed a routine position report and mentioned that I had observed unusual marine phosphorescence during the night. The Coast Guard operator acknowledged my report without comment, and I continued my voyage toward Hawaii with the growing realization that I had experienced something that existed outside the boundaries of normal maritime encounters. I completed the crossing without further incident, arriving in Honolulu 10 days after leaving San Diego. I mentioned the green light to a few fellow sailors at the harbor, describing it as an interesting bioluminescent display, but I didn't share the details about its structured appearance or its apparent intelligence. The sailing community is small and close-knit, and sailors who report seeing impossible things tend to find themselves sailing alone more often than they'd like. But the experience changed how I think about the ocean and what might exist in the vast spaces between our charts and our understanding. The Pacific covers a third of the Earth's surface, with depths that remain largely unexplored and volumes of water that could hide entire civilizations without anyone knowing they were there. We've mapped more of the moon's surface than we have of our own ocean floors, and we know less about what lives in the deep ocean than we do about what might live on Mars. I've made 3 more solo crossings since that August night, always following roughly the same route, always watching the water for any sign of that green glow. I've installed better cameras and more sensitive electronic equipment, hoping that if I encounter something similar again, I'll be able to document it more effectively. But the ocean has remained stubbornly normal, showing me nothing more unusual than the occasional whale or dolphin. Sometimes I wonder if the encounter was a one-time event, a chance meeting with something that normally avoids contact with surface vessels. Other times, I think it might have been a deliberate encounter, that whatever intelligence was operating, that craft specifically chose to reveal itself to a lone sailor who would have no credible way to prove what he had seen. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and I've learned not to expect rational explanations for everything that happens in the deep waters far from land. There are things moving through our oceans that operate according to rules we don't understand, technologies we haven't developed, intelligences we haven't acknowledged. I was privileged to witness one of them for a brief time, and I carry that knowledge with me every time I sail beyond the sight of land. The green light is still out there somewhere, moving through the dark depths of the Pacific, perhaps observing our surface activities with the same curiosity that we bring to studying marine life. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, on deck watching the stars, I scan the water around my boat, hoping for another glimpse of that impossible glow that reminded me how much mystery still exists in the world we think we know so well. I found the listing on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, scrolling through Airbnb while trying to find somewhere to spend a long weekend away from the city. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for months, and I needed the kind of isolation that only comes from being completely disconnected from urban life. The property was listed as the Cabin at Cedar Ridge, a remote retreat in the mountains of western North Carolina, about 3 hours from Charlotte. The photos showed exactly what I was looking for: a rustic log cabin surrounded by dense forest, with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and no visible neighbors. The description emphasized complete privacy and a digital detox, mentioning that cell service was spotty and internet was limited. The host, listed only as Margaret, had excellent reviews from previous guests who praised the tranquility and the chance to truly disconnect from modern life. What struck me as unusual was the price, significantly lower than comparable properties in the area. When I messaged Margaret about availability, she responded within minutes, saying the cabin was open for the weekend I wanted and that she'd send detailed directions since GPS could be unreliable in that part of the mountains. She seemed eager to book, which I attributed to the approaching end of tourist season. I left Charlotte on Friday afternoon, following Margaret's typed directions rather than my GPS, which kept insisting there was no viable route to the address she'd provided. The directions were precise but complex, involving a series of increasingly small roads that branched off from the main highway like tributaries of a river system. After the first hour, I was on roads that didn't appear to have names, just numbers that corresponded to Margaret's handwritten notes. The roads became narrower and more winding, with dense forest pressing in from both sides. I passed very few houses, and those I did see were set so far back from the road that they were barely visible through the trees. There were no businesses, no gas stations, no signs of the usual infrastructure you'd expect even in remote mountain communities. The road wound uphill for about a mile before ending at a small clearing where the cabin sat exactly as it had appeared in the photos. It was perfect, isolated, peaceful, surrounded by towering pines and hardwoods that were just beginning to show their fall colors. Margaret had told me to look for a key in a lockbox mounted beside the front door, but when I approached the cabin, the door was already open. A woman I assumed was Margaret was standing on the porch, waving as I pulled into the clearing. She appeared to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and clothing that looked like it belonged to an earlier era, a long wool skirt, and a hand-knitted sweater that seemed too warm for the October weather. "You must be David," she said as I got out of my car. "I hope the drive wasn't too difficult." I thanked her for meeting me and mentioned that my GPS had been unable to find the address, which she dismissed with a laugh. "Technology doesn't work very well up here," she said. "Too many mountains, too much interference." She gave me a brief tour of the cabin, which was exactly as advertised. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a living room dominated by a massive stone fireplace, already laid with split logs ready for lighting. The furniture was rustic but comfortable, and everything had the well-maintained feel of a property that was regularly cared for. Margaret showed me how to work the wood stove, where to find extra blankets, and how to operate the hand pump for the well water. "There's no cell service, as I mentioned in the listing," she said as we finished the tour, "and the landline is just for emergencies. It connects to the ranger station, about 20 miles away. The refrigerator runs on propane, and there's a generator in the shed if you need electricity for anything important." She left me with a basket of homemade bread and preserves, declining my offer to tip her for meeting me personally. "I live just over the ridge," she said, pointing vaguely toward the forest. "If you need anything, just follow the old logging trail behind the cabin for about a quarter mile." The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin, following several hiking trails that branched off from the clearing. The forest was beautiful and completely silent except for the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I found a creek about half a mile from the cabin and spent an hour sitting beside it, listening to the water flow over smooth stones while reading a book I'd brought. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace and cooked dinner on the wood stove, enjoying the simple pleasure of preparing food without the distractions of television or internet. As darkness fell, I stepped onto the porch and was amazed by the clarity of the night sky, more stars than I'd ever seen, with the Milky Way clearly visible as a bright band across the heavens. The isolation was complete and perfect. It was on Saturday morning that I first noticed something odd. I decided to drive to the nearest town to pick up some additional supplies, thinking I might extend my stay if possible. But when I tried to retrace my route from the previous day, I couldn't find the main road. The dirt road leading away from the cabin branched and curved through the forest in ways I didn't remember, and after an hour of driving, I found myself back at the cabin without having encountered any of the landmarks I'd noted during my arrival. I tried again, this time making careful note of each turn and intersection, but the roads seemed to shift and change, leading me through terrain that looked unfamiliar despite having driven through it just the day before. After my third attempt to leave the area, I was beginning to feel genuinely concerned. I had enough supplies for several more days, but the idea of being unable to find my way out of the mountains was unsettling. That afternoon, I decided to hike to Margaret's house and ask for directions. I followed the logging trail she had mentioned, which led through dense forest for about the distance she'd indicated. But instead of finding another cabin or house, the trail ended at what appeared to be the foundation of a structure that had been demolished years earlier. Moss-covered stones marked the outline of what might once have been a small building, and rusted metal fragments suggested the remains of old appliances or equipment. I called out for Margaret, thinking her house might be nearby, but my voice echoed strangely in the forest, as if the sound was being absorbed by the trees themselves. The silence that followed was profound and somehow unnatural. No bird calls, no insect sounds, nothing but the faint whisper of wind through pine branches. I returned to the cabin, feeling increasingly uneasy. Margaret had said she lived just over the ridge, but I'd found no evidence of any current habitation in that direction. The foundation I'd discovered looked like it had been abandoned for decades, certainly not the home of someone who was actively managing rental properties. That evening, I tried to use the emergency landline Margaret had mentioned. I found the old rotary phone in the kitchen, but when I lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. The line was completely dead, with not even the static you'd expect from a disconnected service. I checked the phone cord and found it properly connected to a wall jack, but there was clearly no active service to the cabin. On Sunday morning, I made one more attempt to drive out of the area, this time using a different strategy. Instead of trying to follow roads, I decided to drive in a straight line toward what I believed was east, hoping to eventually intersect with a major highway. But after 2 hours of careful navigation through forest roads that seemed to curve back on themselves, I found myself once again at the cabin, as if the geography itself was designed to prevent escape. I spent Sunday afternoon searching through the cabin more thoroughly, looking for any information that might explain my situation. In a drawer in the kitchen, I found a guest book that previous visitors had signed. The entries were enthusiastic, praising the isolation and tranquility of the location. But when I looked more closely at the dates, I realized that all of the entries were from several years earlier. The most recent was from 2018, despite the Airbnb listing showing bookings from recent months. More disturbing was what I found in the bedroom closet. Several items of clothing that clearly belonged to previous guests. Men's and women's clothing in various sizes, some of it looking like it had been there for years. There were also personal items, a watch, a pair of glasses, a cell phone that was completely dead. It was as if other visitors had simply left their belongings behind when they departed. I barely slept Sunday night, lying in the bed and listening to sounds that didn't seem quite right. Footsteps on the porch when no one should have been there. Voices in the distance, speaking in words I couldn't quite make out. The creaking of wood that sounded too rhythmic to be random settling. Every time I looked out the windows, I saw only darkness and the vague shapes of trees. But I had the persistent feeling that I was being watched. Monday morning, I packed my belongings and made a final, desperate attempt to leave the area. This time, I abandoned my car and set out on foot, using a compass to maintain a steady bearing toward what I hoped was civilization. I hiked for hours through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing ridges and crossing streams, always moving in the same direction according to my compass. But as the sun began to set, I emerged from the forest into a familiar clearing and found myself standing in front of the cabin I'd been trying to escape. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it, and smoke was rising from the chimney as if someone had built a fire while I was gone. Margaret was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, smiling and waving as if my return was perfectly expected. She asked pleasantly, "I hope you enjoyed exploring the area." I tried to ask her about the dead phone line, about the difficulty I was having finding roads that led away from the cabin, about the personal belongings I'd found in the closet. But she deflected each question with gentle humor, suggesting that I was simply experiencing the disorientation that city people often feel when they first encounter true wilderness. Some places exist outside the ordinary flow of things, she said as the darkness deepened around us. They're refuges from the modern world, sanctuaries where time moves differently and the usual rules don't apply. You came here looking for escape, didn't you? I went to bed that night, knowing that I might never leave the cabin at Cedar Ridge. But strangely, the prospect didn't terrify me as much as it should have. The isolation that had initially seemed perfect was revealing itself to be something far more complete than I had expected. I had wanted to disconnect from the world, and I had found a place where disconnection was absolute and permanent. I'm still here 6 months later. Margaret brings supplies occasionally, appearing on the porch with groceries and household items that I never requested, but somehow always need. The seasons change around the cabin, but the roads never lead anywhere except back to this clearing in the mountains. My cell phone has been dead for months. My car won't start despite having fuel, and the outside world has become as theoretical as a distant planet. I write these words by lamplight, using a notebook I found in the cabin's desk, adding my own entry to the record of people who came to Cedar Ridge looking for temporary escape and found something far more permanent. If you're reading this somehow, if you found your way to this remote Airbnb that doesn't show up on maps, know that the tranquility Margaret promises is real. The isolation is complete, and the escape from modern life is exactly as advertised: total, irreversible, and eternal. The mountains here keep their own time, follow their own rules, and once they accept you as a resident rather than a visitor, they never let you go. I came here for a weekend retreat and found my final destination. The listing is still active, still offering the perfect getaway for stressed urban professionals who need to disconnect from the demands of contemporary life. But be careful what you search for on those travel websites. Sometimes the most perfect vacation rental is perfect precisely because checkout time never comes, and the tranquility you're seeking is the kind that lasts forever. I've been hiking the White Mountains of New Hampshire for over 15 years, and I thought I knew every trail, every ridge, every hidden valley in the region. I'm the kind of hiker who studies topographic maps like other people read novels, and I pride myself on never getting lost, never taking a wrong turn, never ending up anywhere I didn't plan to be. That confidence is what makes what happened to me in September of 2022 so difficult to accept, so impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't there. I was doing a solo day hike on the Franconia Ridge Trail, a route I'd completed at least a dozen times before. It's a challenging but well-marked trail that leads to some of the most spectacular views in New England, and it's popular enough that you're rarely alone on the mountain. I'd started early that morning from the Lafayette Place campground, planning to hike up to Mount Lafayette, across the ridge to Mount Lincoln, and then loop back via the Falling Waters Trail. The weather was perfect for hiking: clear skies, cool temperatures, the kind of crisp September day that makes you remember why you love spending time in the mountains. I'd made good time on the ascent, reaching the tree line in about 2 hours, and enjoying the increasingly expansive views as I climbed higher. Other hikers were scattered along the trail, and I exchanged the usual pleasantries with fellow outdoors enthusiasts who were enjoying the same beautiful day. I reached the summit of Mount Lafayette around noon and spent 20 minutes taking photos and eating lunch while enjoying the panoramic views that stretched across 3 states. The visibility was exceptional. I could see Mount Washington to the northeast, the Connecticut River Valley to the west, and the endless expanse of forest-covered mountains rolling away in every direction. When I started across the ridge toward Mount Lincoln, following the well-worn path that thousands of hikers use every year, everything was exactly as it should have been. The trail was clearly marked with white blazes painted on rocks, and I could see other hikers both ahead of me and behind me on the exposed ridge. But somewhere during that traverse, something went wrong in a way that I still can't fully understand. I remember passing the junction where a side trail branches off toward the Greenleaf Hut, and I remember continuing straight toward Lincoln as I'd planned. But at some point, and I can't pinpoint exactly when, I realized that I couldn't see any other hikers on the trail ahead of or behind me. The mountain ridge that had been dotted with colorful backpacks and hiking poles just minutes before was suddenly empty. At first, I wasn't concerned. Hikers spread out naturally on long trails, and it's not unusual to find yourself alone for stretches, especially if you're moving at a different pace than the groups around you. But as I continued along what I thought was the familiar ridge trail, the landscape began to look different in subtle ways that I couldn't quite identify. The trail was still there, still marked with white blazes, but the terrain around it seemed wrong somehow. The ridgeline was broader than I remembered, with gentle undulations that didn't match the topography I knew from previous hikes. The views to either side were spectacular but unfamiliar. I could see mountain ranges that stretched to horizons that were too distant, valleys that were too deep and too green, forests that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. I stopped and pulled out my map and compass, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere despite the clear trail markings. But according to my compass, I was heading in the right direction, and the elevation readings on my GPS unit seemed consistent with where I should have been on the ridge. Yet the landscape around me didn't match anything on my topographic map. The mountains I could see in the distance were the right general shape and orientation, but they seemed larger, more dramatic, with peaks that rose higher than anything shown on my charts. The valleys between them were deeper and more complex, with what appeared to be lakes and rivers in places where my map showed only continuous forest. It was as if I were looking at a more expansive, more pristine version of the White Mountains, one that existed on a grander scale than the region I thought I knew. I continued hiking, assuming that I would eventually reach a familiar landmark that would help me reorient myself. But the trail kept leading through terrain that became increasingly unfamiliar. I crossed streams that weren't marked on my map, passed through stands of trees that seemed older and larger than any I'd seen in New England, and climbed over small ridges that offered views of landscapes that looked like they belonged in the Canadian Rockies rather than New Hampshire. The strangest part was how pristine everything appeared. In the real White Mountains, you can usually see some evidence of human presence: distant roads, power lines, the cleared areas around ski resorts, the scarred slopes where logging has taken place. But in this landscape, there were no signs of civilization anywhere. The forest stretched unbroken to every horizon, and the mountains rose from valley floors that showed no indication they had ever been touched by human activity. After hiking for what felt like several hours through this impossible terrain, I began to feel genuinely concerned about my situation. My GPS unit was giving readings that didn't correspond to any location on my maps, and my cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in the mountains, but added to my growing sense of isolation. I was carrying enough water and food for a day hike, but if I was truly lost in unfamiliar territory, I needed to start thinking about getting back to known landmarks before dark. I decided to retrace my steps, following the trail back in the direction I had come, but the trail that had brought me to this strange landscape seemed to have changed during my passage. The white blazes were still there, still pointing the way, but they were leading through terrain that I didn't remember hiking through earlier. The ridgeline I followed back was different from the one I had walked across, with different views and different vegetation. As I hiked back, the landscape gradually began to look more familiar. The mountains in the distance slowly returned to their proper proportions. The valleys resumed their expected depths, and the forests took on the appearance of the New England wilderness I knew. After about an hour of backtracking, I encountered other hikers again, a couple with day packs who looked as normal and ordinary as any weekend hikers I'd ever met. I asked them if they'd seen me earlier on the ridge, describing my route and the approximate time I would have passed them. But they looked confused and said they'd been on the trail for the past 3 hours without seeing anyone matching my description. According to them, I would have had to pass them to be where I was, but they had no memory of encountering me on their hike. I continued retracing my route until I reached the summit of Mount Lafayette again, where I found several groups of hikers enjoying the views and taking photos. The mountain looked exactly as it had when I'd left it, with the same familiar peaks visible in the distance and the same well-worn trail markers and rock cairns. But I had no clear memory of how I'd gotten from this normal, recognizable place to the expanded landscape I'd been hiking through. I completed my planned loop via the Falling Waters Trail without further incident, returning to my car at the campground as the sun was setting. The hike down was routine and familiar, following well-marked trails through terrain that matched my maps perfectly. But I kept thinking about those hours I'd spent in a landscape that seemed like an enhanced version of the mountains I thought I knew, a place where everything was the same, but somehow more than it should have been. I've returned to the Franconia Ridge Trail several times since then, always following the same route, always looking for the junction or wrong turn that might lead me back to that impossible landscape. But every hike has been completely normal, taking me across the familiar ridge with its expected views and well-documented terrain. The trail goes exactly where it's supposed to go, leading through mountains that match their descriptions in guidebooks and their representations on topographic maps. I've studied satellite images of the area, looking for hidden valleys or unmapped terrain that might explain what I experienced. I've researched the geological history of the region, thinking that maybe I'd somehow encountered a landscape feature that isn't widely known or documented. I've even consulted with other experienced hikers and trail guides, describing my experience as carefully as I can without sounding like I'd suffered from altitude sickness or heat exhaustion. But none of my research has provided a satisfactory explanation for what happened during those hours when I was lost in a version of the White Mountains that was simultaneously familiar and impossible. The landscape I hiked through was too detailed, too consistent, too real to have been a hallucination. Yet it was also too different from the documented geography of New Hampshire to exist in the world we map and measure and think we understand. I've come to believe that there are places in our most familiar landscapes that exist alongside the terrain we know, accessible only under certain conditions or by certain kinds of mistake. Perhaps getting lost isn't always about taking a wrong turn on a marked trail. Perhaps sometimes it's about stepping sideways into a version of the world that's hidden just beneath the surface of the place we think we're exploring. The mountains keep their secrets, and I suspect that many hikers have found themselves in landscapes that don't appear on any map, walking trails that lead through terrain that's simultaneously real and impossible. Most of us probably find our way back to the familiar world without ever understanding what we've briefly experienced. We dismiss the inconsistencies, rationalize the impossibilities, and continue with our planned routes through the mountains we think we know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm planning future hikes, I find myself studying the topographic maps differently. I look for the spaces between the contour lines, the gaps in our documented knowledge, the places where a trail might lead somewhere other than its marked destination. And I wonder if I'll ever again take a wrong turn that leads me back to that pristine, expanded version of the White Mountains, where the peaks rise higher and the forests stretch farther than any map has ever recorded. The possibility both terrifies and thrills me, because once you've walked through a landscape that exists beyond the boundaries of our measured world, you never stop looking for the hidden trails that might take you back there. Marcus had been my best friend since college, the kind of person you could call at 3 in the morning or trust with your deepest secrets. We'd been camping together for nearly 10 years, exploring state parks and national forests across the Pacific Northwest, and I'd never seen him rattled by anything more serious than a spider in his sleeping bag. That's what made what happened during our trip to the Olympic Peninsula in October 2023 so profoundly disturbing. We'd driven up from Portland for a long weekend of hiking in the Hoh Rainforest, planning to camp at a backcountry site about 5 miles from the visitor center. It was the kind of trip we'd done dozens of times before, just two friends escaping the city for a few days of solitude among the ancient trees and moss-covered trails of one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the country. Marcus seemed completely normal during the drive up and through our first day of hiking. He was his usual self, cracking jokes, pointing out interesting plants and wildlife, taking photos of the massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks that make the Hoh Rainforest feel like a cathedral built by nature. We set up camp beside a small creek, cooked a dinner over a camp stove, and spent the evening talking about work and relationships and all the ordinary concerns that make up daily life. Saturday morning dawned gray and misty, which is typical for that part of Washington. We broke camp early and headed out on a day hike that would take us deeper into the rainforest, following a trail that paralleled the Hoh River for several miles, before turning inland towards some hot springs that Marcus had read about online. The trail was well marked, but not heavily used, winding through some of the most spectacular old-growth forest either of us had ever seen. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when Marcus said he needed to step off the trail for a few minutes. Nothing unusual about that. It's a normal part of backcountry camping. He handed me his day pack and walked into the forest, disappearing behind a massive fallen log about 30 yards from the trail. I sat down on a convenient boulder and waited, enjoying the profound silence of the rainforest and the way the mist created an almost dreamlike atmosphere among the towering trees. After 15 minutes, I called out to Marcus, thinking he might have wandered farther than intended or gotten distracted by something interesting. When he didn't respond, I called louder, my voice echoing strangely among the huge tree trunks. Still no response. I walked over to where he'd entered the forest and found his tracks in the soft earth, but they seemed to disappear after just a few yards, as if he'd simply vanished into the undergrowth. I spent the next hour searching for him, calling his name and following what I thought might be his path through the dense vegetation. The rainforest canopy was so thick that very little light reached the forest floor, and visibility was limited to maybe 20 or 30 feet in any direction. I found myself becoming disoriented despite staying close to the main trail, and I began to worry that I might get lost myself while looking for Marcus. I returned to our original stopping point and waited, thinking that Marcus might have gotten turned around and would eventually find his way back to the trail. But as the hours passed, my concern grew into genuine fear. Marcus was an experienced hiker who understood basic wilderness safety. He wouldn't have wandered far from the trail without telling me, and he certainly wouldn't have left his pack behind if he'd planned to explore extensively. By mid-afternoon, I was preparing to hike back to the trailhead to get help from park rangers when I heard movement in the forest. I called out to Marcus, and after a moment, I heard his voice responding from the same general direction where he'd disappeared hours earlier. But something about his voice sounded wrong. The tone was flat, emotionless, lacking the warmth and familiarity I was used to hearing. Marcus emerged from behind the same fallen log where he'd disappeared, walking slowly and deliberately toward the trail. At first glance, he looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same build, same facial features. But as he got closer, I began to notice subtle differences that made my skin crawl. His expression was completely blank, devoid of the animated intelligence that had always characterized his face. His eyes, which had always been bright and alert, now seemed dull and unfocused, as if he were looking through me rather than at me. I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. Marcus stared at me for several seconds before responding, as if he needed to process the question before formulating an answer. "I got lost," he said finally, his voice carrying that same flat, emotionless quality I'd noticed when he'd called out from the forest. I asked him where he'd been, how he'd gotten lost so close to the trail, whether he was hurt or needed help. But his answers were minimal and strange, delivered in a monotone that bore no resemblance to his usual animated way of speaking. He claimed to have no memory of the past 6 hours, said he'd found himself sitting beside a creek with no recollection of how he'd gotten there. What disturbed me most was his body language. Marcus had always been physically expressive, using his hands when he talked, shifting his weight from foot to foot, displaying the constant subtle movements that characterize a living, animated person. But now he stood perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides, his posture rigid and unnatural. When he walked, his movements were mechanical and deliberate, lacking the easy, unconscious grace he'd always displayed. I suggested we head back to our campsite, concerned that Marcus might be suffering from some kind of medical emergency, a concussion perhaps, or severe dehydration that was affecting his mental state. But he seemed reluctant to move, standing on the trail and staring into the forest with that blank, unfocused expression. When I picked up his day pack and handed it to him, he took it without acknowledgement, as if I were a stranger performing an unremarkable service. The hike back to camp was deeply unsettling. Marcus walked behind me in complete silence, his footsteps maintaining an unnaturally regular rhythm that sounded more like a machine than a human being navigating rough terrain. When I tried to engage him in conversation, asking about what he remembered, how he was feeling, whether anything hurt, his responses were minimal and delivered in that same emotionless monotone. That evening, I watched Marcus go through the motions of setting up his sleeping area and preparing dinner, but everything he did seemed wrong somehow. He performed each task correctly, but without any of the personal flourishes or habits that make individual behavior recognizable. He set up his tent with mechanical precision, arranged his gear with perfect organization, and ate his dinner methodically without any sign of enjoyment or distaste. Most disturbing was his reaction to things that should have been familiar to him. When I mentioned a story about a previous camping trip that we'd laughed about many times, he stared at me blankly as if hearing it for the first time. When I asked him about his job, his family, or mutual friends, his responses were vague and generic, lacking any personal detail or emotional connection. I barely slept that night, lying in my tent and listening to the absolute silence from Marcus's tent just a few yards away. No movement, no shifting in his sleeping bag, no subtle sounds of breathing or the unconscious adjustments that people make while sleeping. It was as if there were no one in the tent at all, despite having watched him enter it hours earlier. The next morning, Marcus emerged from his tent, looking exactly as he had when he'd gone to sleep. Clothes unwrinkled, hair uncombed, but not disheveled in the way you'd expect after a night in the wilderness. He went about his morning routine with the same mechanical precision he displayed the evening before, packing his gear and preparing for the hike out without any conversation or acknowledgement of my presence. I tried several times during the hike back to the trailhead to engage him in normal conversation, but his responses became increasingly minimal. By the time we reached my car, he was communicating almost entirely in nods and single-word answers. The drive back to Portland was conducted in nearly complete silence, with Marcus staring out the passenger window with that same blank, unfocused expression. When I dropped him off at his apartment, he got out of the car, took his gear from the back seat, and walked toward his building without saying goodbye or acknowledging our weekend together in any way. I called after him, asking if he was okay, if he needed me to drive him to a hospital or stay with him for a while. He turned back and looked at me with those dull, empty eyes. "I'm fine," he said in that flat, emotionless voice. Then he walked into his building and disappeared. I didn't hear from Marcus for 2 weeks after that trip. When I finally called him, concerned about his well-being, he answered the phone with the same strange monotone voice. He claimed to be fine, said he'd been busy with work, and showed no memory of our conversation when I dropped him off or of my obvious concern about his condition. When I asked him about the camping trip, he described it in vague, generic terms, as if he'd read about it in a guidebook rather than lived through it. I tried visiting him several times over the following months, but each encounter was more disturbing than the last. Marcus continued to look like my friend and to respond to his name, but there was nothing behind his eyes, no spark of recognition or familiarity when he saw me. He went through the motions of normal life, going to work, paying bills, maintaining his apartment, but he did everything with that same mechanical precision, without any sign of personality or emotional engagement. Our mutual friends began to notice that something was wrong, though they couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. Marcus still attended social gatherings when invited, but he would sit quietly in corners, responding to direct questions with minimal answers, and showing no interest in the conversations happening around him. He never initiated contact with anyone, never suggested activities, never displayed any of the enthusiasm or curiosity that had once made him such engaging company. The person who came back from the Olympic rainforest looked like Marcus, sounded like Marcus, and possessed Marcus's memories and knowledge. But whatever essential quality had made him who he was, his personality, his humor, his emotional depth, his capacity for connection, had been left behind in those woods. What returned was a perfect shell, a biological replica that could perform all the functions of human life without any of the inner experience that makes those functions meaningful. I've never returned to the Hoh rainforest, and I've never found a rational explanation for what happened to my friend during those 6 hours when he vanished into the ancient forest. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, the real Marcus, lost among those towering trees and moss-covered logs, while something else continues to wear his face and live his life in the world he left behind. The thing that haunts me most is that whatever came back is content with its existence. It doesn't seem to miss the emotional richness of human experience. It doesn't appear to suffer from its inability to form genuine connections. It doesn't show any awareness that something fundamental is missing from its life. It simply exists, going through the motions of being Marcus, without any understanding of what Marcus actually was. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder how many other people I know might be similar replacements, perfect copies that returned from places where the original versions disappeared forever. Because once you've seen how convincing such a replacement can be, you start to notice the subtle differences in everyone, the missing spark behind familiar eyes, the mechanical quality of once natural movements, the hollow echo where genuine laughter used to be. I'm a light sleeper by nature, so when someone knocked on my front door at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, I was awake before the second rap of knuckles against wood. Living alone in a ranch house on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon, I'm not accustomed to late-night visitors. The nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away, and the kind of people who might have legitimate business at my door after midnight are usually the kind you don't want to let inside. I lay in bed for a moment, listening and hoping I'd imagined the sound. But then it came again, not the urgent pounding of an emergency, not the tentative tapping of someone who wasn't sure they had the right address. It was deliberate, patient knocking, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were and was prepared to wait for an answer. I pulled on a robe and walked quietly to the front door, trying to see who was outside without making my presence obvious. The porch light was off. I never leave it on overnight, and the nearest street light is too far away to illuminate my front yard. Through the peephole, I could make out the silhouette of a tall man standing on my porch, but the darkness obscured any details about his appearance or clothing. I called through the door, trying to project authority despite feeling vulnerable in my pajamas. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," came the reply. The voice was calm, articulate, with the kind of measured tone that suggested education and middle-class background. "I was wondering if you might have seen the lights tonight." I looked through the peephole again, still unable to make out more than the basic outline of a person standing patiently on my porch. Something about the situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. People don't typically go door to door in the middle of the night asking neighbors about lights in the sky, no matter how unusual those lights might have been. I asked, maintaining the barrier of the locked door between us. There were some unusual aerial phenomena about an hour ago, the man replied. Bright lights moving in formations that don't match conventional aircraft. I hadn't seen any lights, unusual or otherwise. I'd been asleep since around 11, and my bedroom faces east while my front door faces west. If there had been something noteworthy in the sky, I likely would have missed it. But something about the man's explanation didn't sit right with me. Even if he'd seen unusual lights, what kind of person goes knocking on strangers' doors at 2 in the morning to discuss them? I didn't see anything, I said, and it's pretty late to be asking neighbors about this. Time is a factor, he replied, his voice carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been there before. The observations need to be documented while they're fresh in people's minds. I moved away from the door and looked out the front window, trying to get a better view of my unexpected visitor. He was tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a dark suit despite the late hour and casual nature of the neighborhood. His posture was perfectly upright, and he stood motionless on my porch as if he were comfortable waiting indefinitely for my cooperation. I asked. I'm conducting an independent investigation, he said. Something about his formal language and persistence was becoming increasingly unsettling. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, and I know most of my neighbors by sight, if not by name. This man wasn't familiar, and his middle-of-the-night survey of local residents struck me as highly inappropriate, regardless of what he might have seen in the sky. I'm not comfortable discussing this right now, I said firmly. That won't be necessary, he replied immediately. Either you saw the lights, or you didn't. I looked out the window again and noticed something that made my unease spike into genuine concern. The man wasn't just standing on my porch, he was standing perfectly still. No shifting of weight from foot to foot, no unconscious adjustments of posture, none of the subtle movements that characterize a living person waiting in one place. He stood like a statue, as if he were made of stone rather than flesh and blood. I think you should leave now, I said, moving back toward the door and making sure the deadbolt was securely engaged. Of course, he said, his voice maintaining the same calm, measured tone. I apologize for the intrusion. I heard footsteps moving away from the door, but when I looked through the peephole, I couldn't see anyone. I waited several minutes before checking the front window again, but my porch and front yard appeared to be empty. The man had apparently left as quietly as he'd arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the encounter had been fundamentally wrong. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, occasionally getting up to check the windows and make sure my doors were locked. Every sound seemed amplified, the house settling, the refrigerator cycling on, the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I found myself straining to hear footsteps or voices that might indicate the strange visitor had returned. The next morning, I walked around my property looking for any sign that someone had been there during the night. I found footprints in the soft earth near my front porch, but they were oddly uniform. perfectly rectangular impressions that looked more like they'd been made by wooden blocks than by shoes. The prints led from my porch to the edge of my driveway, where they stopped abruptly on the pavement. I asked my closest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, if anyone had knocked on her door during the night. She hadn't been disturbed, but she mentioned that her dog had been restless around 2 in the morning, barking and whining as if something outside had upset him. When I described my visitor, she looked concerned and said she'd never seen anyone matching that description in the neighborhood. Over the following days, I made discreet inquiries with other neighbors, asking if anyone had seen unusual lights or had unexpected visitors. No one reported seeing anything unusual in the sky, and no one else had been contacted by a man asking about aerial phenomena. It seemed that I was the only person in the neighborhood who had received this strange late-night visit. About a week later, I was talking with a coworker who lives about 10 miles away when she mentioned something that made me stop what I was doing and pay close attention. She said that someone had knocked on her door in the middle of the night recently, asking if she'd seen lights in the sky. When I asked her to describe the visitor, her description matched my experience exactly. Tall, thin man in a dark suit, speaking in formal, measured language, asking specifically about unusual aerial phenomena. She'd been more cautious than I had been, refusing to answer the door and only speaking to the visitor through the intercom system in her apartment building. But she said the man had been persistent, repeating his questions about lights and asking for detailed information about what she might have observed. When she'd refused to engage with him, he'd left without argument, but she'd found the entire encounter deeply unsettling. I started researching online, looking for similar reports of people going door to door, asking about unusual lights or aerial phenomena. What I found was a pattern of such encounters stretching back decades, reported from rural areas and small towns across the country. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, always a tall, thin man in dark clothing, always asking specifically about lights in the sky, always appearing at unusual hours when most people would be reluctant to answer their doors. Some of the reports included details that aligned perfectly with my own experience. The visitor's formal, emotionless way of speaking, his unnatural stillness while waiting for responses, the way he seemed to vanish quickly and completely after being dismissed. Most disturbing were the accounts from people who had actually let such visitors into their homes and later reported feeling like they'd been interrogated rather than interviewed. I never saw my late-night visitor again, but the experience changed how I think about the boundary between my private life and whatever forces might be monitoring or investigating events that occur beyond public awareness. Someone or something is keeping track of unusual phenomena, documenting witness accounts, maintaining records of things that most people never see or acknowledge. The man who knocked on my door at 2 a.m. wasn't a neighbor concerned about strange lights. He wasn't a researcher from a university or a government agency. He was something else, part of a systematic effort to catalog and control information about events that don't fit into our official understanding of reality. And the most unsettling part is that he found me without any indication that I'd seen anything unusual. He knocked on my door as if he knew I lived there, as if he had some reason to believe I might have witnessed whatever lights he was asking about. That suggests a level of surveillance and information gathering that extends far beyond anything we're supposed to know about. I've installed motion activated lights around my property and upgraded my door locks, but I know that if my strange visitor wants to return, such precautions won't stop him. He's part of something larger, something that operates according to rules I don't understand and with resources I can't imagine. Sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I find myself looking out the window and scanning the sky for unusual lights. Not because I want to see them, but because I want to be prepared if they appear. Because now I know that someone is watching, someone is keeping track, and someone will come knocking in the dark hours of the morning to ask what I've seen. And next time, I'm not sure I'll have the luxury of refusing to answer. The dream started in late November, just after I moved to the small coastal town of Millhaven for a new job at the local library. I'd been having trouble sleeping in the unfamiliar apartment, so when I began dreaming vividly every night, I assumed it was just my mind's way of processing the stress of relocation. But these weren't typical anxiety dreams about forgetting important tasks or being unprepared for situations. They were all variations of the same recurring image: a tall, slender tower rising from a rocky promontory beside dark water. In the first dream, I was standing on a beach looking up at this tower, which appeared to be made of weathered stone blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision. It was maybe 8 or 9 stories tall, perfectly cylindrical, with no visible windows or doors. At its top was a structure that looked like it might once have been a lighthouse lens housing, though no light emanated from it. The tower stood alone against a gray sky, surrounded by choppy water on 3 sides, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of rocks. Each night, the dream would vary slightly, but the tower remained constant. Sometimes I would be closer to it, close enough to see the individual stones and the way they'd been carved to fit together without mortar. Sometimes I would be viewing it from a boat on the water, watching waves crash against the rocky foundation. Occasionally, I would find myself standing at the base of the tower, running my hands along the smooth stone surface while searching for some way to enter. What struck me most about these dreams was their incredible consistency and detail. Usually, my dreams are fragmentary and surreal, mixing impossible scenarios with people and places from my daily life. But the tower dreams were different. They felt more like memories than dreams, complete with sensory details, like the salt smell of ocean air and the sound of waves against stone. I would wake up feeling like I'd actually visited this place, even though I was certain I'd never seen anything like it in real life. After 3 weeks of nightly tower dreams, I started sketching what I was seeing, trying to capture the details that seemed so vivid during sleep, but tended to fade during the day. I'm not much of an artist, but I found myself able to draw the tower with surprising accuracy, including architectural details that I shouldn't have been able to remember so precisely. The proportions, the texture of the stonework, the way the structure curved slightly inward as it rose, all of it came through in my sketches as if I were drawing from a photograph. I mentioned the recurring dreams to my new co-workers at the library, partly out of curiosity about local landmarks, and partly because the dreams were becoming so persistent that they were affecting my ability to get restful sleep. When I described the tower and showed them my sketches, most people shook their heads and said they'd never seen anything like it. But Mrs. Carradine, the head librarian who'd worked in Millhaven for over 30 years, looked at my drawings with an expression of recognition and concern. "That looks like Beacon Point," she said quietly, "but that can't be right." She explained that Beacon Point was a rocky outcropping about 5 miles north of town, accessible only by a rough hiking trail that followed the coastline. There had once been a lighthouse there, built in the 1890s to guide ships past a dangerous reef, but it had been decommissioned in the 1940s when new navigation technology made it obsolete. The lighthouse had been demolished in the 1950s, and now there was nothing at Beacon Point except the concrete foundation and some scattered stones. Mrs. Carradine's description didn't match what I was seeing in my dreams. The tower in my nocturnal visions was clearly intact and appeared to be in good condition, not the ruins of a demolished lighthouse. But something about her mention of Beacon Point resonated with me in a way I couldn't explain. I felt a strong compulsion to visit the site to see for myself what remained of the original lighthouse. That Saturday, I drove to the trailhead and began the hike to Beacon Point. The trail was poorly maintained and clearly not used frequently, winding through dense coastal forest before emerging onto rocky cliffs that offered spectacular views of the ocean. The hike took about an hour and a half, and by the time I reached the end of the trail, I was questioning whether I was following the right path. Then I crested a small rise and saw Beacon Point spread out before me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The promontory looked exactly as it had appeared in my dreams. The same rocky outcropping, the same narrow connection to the mainland, the same dramatic position overlooking dark water. But instead of the intact tower I'd been dreaming about, I found only ruins. Crumbling concrete foundations marked where the lighthouse had once stood, and scattered blocks of dressed stone were partially hidden by decades of vegetation growth. I spent an hour exploring the ruins, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the vivid dreams that had brought me here. The foundation was roughly circular and the right size for the base of the tower I'd been dreaming about, but there was no structure, no towering stonework, nothing that matched the detailed architecture my sleeping mind had constructed night after night. As I was preparing to leave, disappointed by the discrepancy between dream and reality, I noticed something that made me stop and look more carefully. Among the scattered stones that littered the site, I found several blocks that were carved with the same precise joinery I'd seen in my dreams. The stonework was distinctive. Each block had been shaped to fit with its neighbors, using a technique that didn't require mortar, creating joints so tight that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. I pulled out my phone and compared photos of the ruins with the sketches I'd made of my dream tower. The stonework was identical. The proportions of the foundation matched the base of the tower in my drawings. Even the way the rocks fell away toward the water corresponded exactly to the landscape I'd been visiting in my sleep. That night, the dreams changed. Instead of seeing the intact tower, I found myself standing among ruins that looked exactly like what I'd discovered at Beacon Point. But in the dream, I could see shadows and impressions of the structure that had once stood there, like a photographic negative that showed what had been removed rather than what remained. The tower was gone, but its presence lingered in the space it had once occupied. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with the history of the Beacon Point Lighthouse. I spent hours in the library's local history collection, reading old newspaper articles, examining historical photographs, and studying maritime records that documented the lighthouse's construction and eventual demolition. What I found was a structure that looked exactly like the tower in my dreams. The Beacon Point Light had been built in 1891 using locally quarried granite, fitted together with the distinctive mortarless joinery technique that had caught my attention in the ruins. Historical photographs showed a tall, cylindrical tower that matched my dream sketches in every detail, from its proportions to the lens housing at its top. The lighthouse had operated for over 50 years before being decommissioned, and it had been demolished in 1953 when the Coast Guard determined that maintaining the structure was no longer cost effective. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a collection of personal papers donated by the family of the lighthouse's last keeper. Among the documents was a journal that described strange dreams experienced by several keepers over the decades. Multiple men had reported recurring dreams about the lighthouse appearing in perfect condition long after it had fallen into disrepair, dreams so vivid that they would wake up believing they were still on duty at a functioning station. One entry, dated 1949, described dreams that were nearly identical to mine. I see the light as it was in its glory days, every stone perfect, the lens gleaming like it's just been polished. But when I wake and look out the window, I see only what remains: cracked walls, missing sections, the slow surrender to time and weather. I realized that I had been experiencing the same phenomenon that had affected the lighthouse keepers, dreams that showed not what existed in the present, but what had existed in the past, as if the location itself retained some kind of memory that could be accessed through sleep. The tower in my dreams wasn't a fantasy or a symbolic representation. It was an accurate depiction of a structure that had once stood on that exact spot, preserved in some way that allowed certain people to experience it decades after its physical destruction. The dreams gradually faded over the following months, occurring less frequently until they stopped altogether. But my understanding of the relationship between place and memory had been fundamentally altered. I had experienced firsthand how locations can retain impressions of their past, how the landscape itself can hold onto images of what has been built and destroyed, what has been loved and abandoned. I still visit Beacon Point occasionally, hiking out to the ruins and sitting among the scattered stones while looking out over the water. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light is just right, I can almost see the tower as it once was, tall and proud and purposeful, standing guard over dangerous waters. But I know that what I'm seeing is just the interplay of memory and imagination, the echo of dreams that showed me a past I never lived but somehow experienced. The experience taught me that some places are more than just geographical locations. They're repositories of human experience, keepers of stories that continue long after the physical evidence has crumbled away. And sometimes, if you're sensitive to such things, if you sleep in the right place at the right time, you might find yourself visiting these preserved moments, walking through dreams that are actually memories belonging to the landscape itself. I never learned why I was susceptible to these particular dreams, why Beacon Point chose to share its memories with someone who had no connection to its history. But I'm grateful for the experience, for the chance to see something beautiful that had been lost, to understand that destruction isn't always final, and that some things endure in ways we don't expect or fully understand. The tower may be gone, but it continues to exist in the dreams of those who are called to witness what once was, keeping alive the memory of human ambition and the enduring beauty of structures built to guide travelers safely through dangerous waters. I've been caving for 15 years, and I thought I'd developed a healthy respect for the underground world, its beauty, its dangers, and its capacity to humble even experienced spelunkers. What I found in the Whispering Caverns system in West Virginia last August challenged everything I thought I knew about the history hidden beneath our feet. The Whispering Caverns aren't well known outside the caving community. They're located on private land about 50 miles southeast of Charleston, accessible only with permission from the landowner and requiring a technical descent through a narrow opening that's been enlarged just enough to allow human passage. The cave system was discovered in the 1970s by local cavers, but it's never been fully mapped due to its complexity and the technical challenges involved in exploring its deeper passages. I was part of a small expedition team, myself, two other experienced cavers, and a geology graduate student who was studying limestone formations in the region. We had permission to spend 3 days mapping and photographing previously unexplored sections of the cave system with the goal of extending the known passages and documenting any significant geological features we encountered. The cave entrance drops vertically for about 60 feet before opening into a large chamber that serves as the main hub for the horizontal passages that branch off in multiple directions. We'd spent our first day mapping the known sections and setting up our base camp in the large chamber. On the second day, we decided to explore a narrow passage that previous cavers had noted but never fully investigated due to its challenging dimensions. The passage required us to crawl for about 200 feet through a space that was barely wide enough for an adult human body. It was uncomfortable and claustrophobic, even for experienced cavers, but it eventually opened into a series of smaller chambers connected by more manageable corridors. We were excited to be exploring Virgin Cave, mapping passages that no human had ever documented. It was in the third chamber of this newly explored section that we found something that shouldn't have existed. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with a high domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our helmet lights. The walls were typical limestone, worn smooth by millennia of water flow, but as we began our standard documentation process, Sarah, our geology student, called out from the far side of the chamber. "There's something carved into the wall over here," she said, her voice carrying an excitement that made the rest of us converge on her position quickly. What we found was a section of wall covered with intricate carvings that had been cut directly into the limestone. At first glance, they looked like elaborate decorative patterns, flowing curves and geometric shapes that formed complex interlocking designs. But as we examined them more closely with our powerful LED lights, We realized that these weren't random decorations, they were technical diagrams. The carvings showed what appeared to be cross sections of mechanical devices, complete with gears, levers, and moving parts that were depicted with extraordinary precision. Some of the diagrams showed what looked like hydraulic systems with channels and chambers that suggested sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics. Others appeared to be astronomical charts showing celestial movements with mathematical accuracy that indicated advanced knowledge of planetary mechanics. What made these carvings so disturbing wasn't just their complexity, but their obvious age. The limestone around the carved areas showed clear signs of having been worked centuries, possibly millennia ago. The edges of the carvings were softened by natural weathering, and in some places, flowstone deposits had begun to cover portions of the diagrams, indicating that they predated the geological processes that were still slowly altering the cave's appearance. But the technology depicted in these carvings was far beyond anything that should have existed when they were created. I'm not an engineer, but I know enough about mechanical principles to recognize sophisticated concepts when I see them. These diagrams showed gear ratios that wouldn't be discovered until the Renaissance, hydraulic systems that resembled modern industrial equipment, and astronomical calculations that suggested knowledge of planetary movements that wasn't achieved by European science until the 16th century. Mike, the most experienced caver in our group, found a section of wall that contained what appeared to be a series of mathematical equations carved in symbolic notation that none of us could interpret. The symbols were unlike any historical writing system we were familiar with, but their arrangement suggested advanced mathematical concepts. Variables and operators were clearly distinguished, and the equations appeared to be describing complex relationships between multiple factors. We spent hours documenting the carvings, taking hundreds of photographs from every angle and making detailed sketches of the most significant diagrams. The chamber contained what appeared to be a complete technical library, with different sections of wall devoted to different subjects: mechanical engineering, astronomy, mathematics, and what might have been chemistry or metallurgy. As we worked, we began to notice that the carvings weren't randomly distributed around the chamber. They were organized according to some kind of system, with related diagrams grouped together and clear pathways of progression from simple concepts to more complex applications. It was as if someone had used the cave chamber as a permanent repository for advanced technical knowledge, carving information into the stone to preserve it for future discovery. The most unsettling discovery came when Tom found a section of carvings that appeared to depict the cave system itself. Detailed maps were carved into the stone, showing not only the passages we had explored, but also extensive tunnel systems that extended far beyond anything that had been previously discovered. The maps indicated chambers and corridors that would take years to reach and explore, as well as connections to other cave systems that weren't known to exist in the area. But these cave maps also showed structures that couldn't be natural formations. Perfect geometric chambers, corridors with precisely engineered dimensions, and what appeared to be vertical shafts that descended far deeper than the known cave system. It was as if someone had extensively modified the natural cave structure, creating an underground complex that was part natural cavern and part engineered facility. We documented everything we could in the time we had available, but it was clear that a complete study of the carvings would require a team of specialists and weeks of careful work. When we finally emerged from the cave system 3 days later, we were carrying evidence of something that challenged conventional understanding of both regional history and the development of human technology. I've shared our photographs and documentation with archaeologists, historians, and engineering specialists, but no one has been able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what we found. The carvings clearly predate any known advanced civilization in the region, yet they demonstrate technological understanding that shouldn't have existed anywhere in the world at the time they were created. Some experts have suggested that the carvings might be more recent than they appear, created by modern engineers or scientists who had access to the cave system and wanted to create an elaborate hoax. But the geological evidence doesn't support that theory. The weathering patterns and flowstone deposits indicate that the carvings are genuinely ancient. Others have proposed that the diagrams might represent rediscovered knowledge from a lost civilization, perhaps preserving technical information that was developed elsewhere and brought to this remote cave for safekeeping. But that explanation raises even more questions about who possessed such advanced knowledge and why they chose this particular location to preserve it. The landowner has restricted access to the cave since our expedition, citing concerns about safety and preservation of what might be an important archaeological site. But I know that there are other chambers as deeper in the system, other sections of wall that might contain even more advanced carvings, additional evidence of whoever created this underground technical library. What disturbs me most is the possibility that these carvings represent knowledge that was once commonplace but has been lost to time and disaster. The precision and sophistication of the diagrams suggest a civilization that achieved technological advancement far earlier than our current historical models indicate, then disappeared so completely that only these hidden cave carvings remain as evidence of their achievements. I think about those maps of extended cave systems, the chambers and corridors that we haven't yet explored, the vertical shafts that descend to unknown depths. Somewhere in the darkness beneath West Virginia, there might be entire complexes created by people who understood engineering principles that we're only now rediscovering, who possessed mathematical knowledge that we think of as modern innovations. The whispering caverns hold secrets that challenge our understanding of human history and technological development. What we found in that circular chamber represents either evidence of a lost civilization that achieved remarkable advancement, or proof that knowledge can somehow transcend the normal flow of time, appearing in places where it shouldn't exist, according to everything we think we know about the progression of human understanding. I may never know the truth about who created those carvings or how they acquired the knowledge to produce such sophisticated technical diagrams. But I know that deep beneath the surface of our mapped and measured world, there are repositories of wisdom that suggest our ancestors were far more advanced than we've given them credit for, and that the darkness below still holds revelations that could fundamentally change how we understand our place in the long history of human achievement. I was 3 hours into what should have been a routine drive from Denver to Kansas City when the world around me shifted into something that felt fundamentally wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of perfect autumn day when the prairie stretches endlessly under clear blue skies and you can see approaching weather systems from 50 miles away. I'd made this drive dozens of times for work, and I knew every truck stop, every small town, every mile marker along the way. I was somewhere between Colby and Oakley, driving east on I-70 through the heart of Kansas wheat country when I first noticed the change in the light. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the quality of the sunshine that made me glance up at the sky through my windshield. What I saw there made me slow down and eventually pull over to the shoulder of the highway. The sky was turning orange, not the warm, gradual orange of sunset, which was still hours away, but a sudden uniform orange that seemed to be spreading across the entire dome of the sky like spilled paint. It started at the western horizon and moved eastward with visible speed, transforming the familiar blue of afternoon into something alien and unsettling. I got out of my car and stood beside the highway, watching this impossible phenomenon unfold above me. The orange deepened as it spread, becoming more intense and more uniform until the entire sky looked like the inside of a pumpkin. But there were no clouds, no visible source for the color change. The sun was still visible as a brighter disk within the orange expanse, but it provided no explanation for what was happening to the atmosphere around it. As the sky completed its transformation, something else changed that was even more disturbing than the visual anomaly. The world became silent, not just quiet, completely, utterly silent, in a way that felt physically oppressive. The constant background noise that you don't notice until it's gone, wind through grass, distant traffic, the hum of insects, even the sound of my own breathing, all of it simply stopped. I stood on the shoulder of Interstate 70, surrounded by thousands of acres of prairie and farmland, and heard absolutely nothing. No birds, no wind, no rustle of vegetation. When I clapped my hands together, the sound seemed muffled and strange, as if the air itself had become too thick to carry sound properly. My footsteps on the gravel shoulder sounded distant and hollow, like I was hearing them through water. The silence was so complete that it made me dizzy. I realized how much we depend on subtle, auditory cues to orient ourselves in space, and without them, the world felt unstable and dreamlike. I could see cars in the distance on the highway, but I couldn't hear their engines. I could see a farmhouse maybe half a mile away, but there was no sound of machinery, no barking dogs, no signs of life that I could detect through my ears. I got back in my car and tried the radio, thinking that maybe whatever was causing the atmospheric disturbance might also be affecting electromagnetic signals. But the radio worked normally, picking up stations from Denver and Kansas City with clear reception. The music and voices from the speakers sounded normal inside the car, but when I rolled down the windows, the outside world remained locked in that unnatural silence. I started driving again, partly because staying in one place felt more frightening than moving, and partly because I hoped that whatever phenomenon I was experiencing might be localized to a particular area. But as I continued east on I-70, the orange sky and the oppressive silence traveled with me. Other vehicles were on the highway. I could see them in the distance and in my mirrors, but they seemed to be moving through the same strange atmosphere that had enveloped me. For the next hour, I drove through this transformed landscape, watching familiar landmarks appear and disappear under the orange sky. The grain elevators and farmhouses looked the same, but they seemed somehow less real, like props in a movie set rather than actual buildings where people lived and worked. The wheat fields stretched to the horizon as they always did, but under the orange light they looked alien and unsettling. I tried calling my office on my cell phone to report what I was experiencing, but while the phone showed good signal strength, every call went straight to voicemail without ringing. Text messages seemed to send normally, but I received no responses. It was as if I had been cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this bubble of orange light and unnatural silence. The strangest part was how other drivers seemed to be reacting to the phenomenon. I could see cars ahead of me and behind me, all traveling at normal highway speeds, but no one was pulling over or showing signs of distress. It was as if I were the only person who could see the orange sky or notice the absence of sound. When I passed other vehicles, or they passed me, the drivers looked completely normal, focused on the road ahead as if nothing unusual was happening. Around 4:30 p.m., about 2 hours after the phenomenon had begun, I noticed a change. The orange began to fade from the western edge of the sky, retreating eastward with the same visible speed it had arrived with. As the normal blue of afternoon returned, sound gradually came back to the world. First a faint whisper of wind, then the distant hum of traffic, then the full spectrum of environmental noise that makes the world feel alive and real. Within 15 minutes, everything had returned to normal. The sky was its familiar blue, scattered with a few white clouds that looked perfectly ordinary. The prairie wind was audible again. Birds were calling from fence posts, and the highway carried the usual sounds of traffic and civilization. It was as if the previous 2 hours had been erased, leaving no trace of the orange light or the oppressive silence. I pulled into the next rest area and sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what I had just experienced. I called my office again, and this time the phone rang normally. When my secretary answered, I asked if she'd received my earlier calls or text messages. She said she'd gotten a text from me about 2 hours earlier, saying I was making good time on the drive, but nothing since then. I checked local news websites and weather services, looking for any reports of unusual atmospheric conditions or unexplained phenomena in central Kansas, but I found nothing. No reports of strange weather, no social media posts about orange skies, no indication that anyone else had experienced what I had just lived through. I continued my drive to Kansas City, arriving on schedule that evening. During business meetings over the following days, I casually asked colleagues if they'd heard any unusual stories about atmospheric phenomena or weather anomalies in Kansas. But no one had any information, and my careful inquiries produced nothing but puzzled looks and suggestions that I might have witnessed some kind of unusual dust storm or optical illusion. I've made that same drive numerous times since then, always paying careful attention to the sky and the ambient sound levels as I cross the Kansas prairie. But I've never again experienced anything like those 2 hours when the world transformed into something alien and unsettling. The sky remains blue, the wind continues to blow across the wheat fields, and the familiar sounds of rural life provide their constant background reassurance. But the experience changed how I think about the apparent stability of our environment. For 2 hours, I drove through a version of Kansas that existed according to different rules, where light behaved strangely and sound simply didn't exist. It was the same landscape I'd traveled through many times before, but it had been temporarily transformed into something that felt like it belonged to a different planet. I've researched atmospheric phenomena, electromagnetic anomalies, and various scientific explanations for unusual sky colors and acoustic effects. While there are documented cases of strange atmospheric conditions that can affect light and sound, nothing I've found adequately explains the uniformity and completeness of what I experienced. The orange sky was too consistent, the silence too absolute, the duration too long to match any known meteorological phenomenon. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow drove through a gap in reality, a place where the normal rules of physics were temporarily suspended or replaced by something else. The fact that other drivers seemed unaffected suggests that the phenomenon might have been somehow specific to my perception, but I know what I saw and heard, or failed to hear. It was too real, too detailed, too consistent to have been a hallucination or psychological episode. The Kansas prairie looks the same as it always did when I drive through it now, but I know that beneath its familiar appearance lies the possibility of transformation into something far stranger. Somewhere between Colby and Oakley, there's a stretch of highway where the sky can turn orange without warning, and the world can fall silent in defiance of everything we think we know about how reality is supposed to behave. And sometimes, late at night when I'm planning another trip across the plains, I find myself both hoping for and dreading the possibility that I might once again find myself driving through that transformed landscape, that orange-lit world where silence reigns and the familiar becomes inexplicably alien. I was helping my grandmother clean out her attic last March when I found the shoebox full of old photographs tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations that hadn't been used in years. She was moving to assisted living, and we were sorting through decades of accumulated family memories, deciding what to keep and what could finally be discarded. Most of the photos were exactly what you'd expect. Faded color snapshots from the 19s and 80s, black and white portraits of relatives I barely remembered, the usual documentations of birthdays and holidays and family gatherings. I was about halfway through the box when I found a photograph that made me stop sorting and stare in confusion. It was a color photo, slightly faded but in good condition, showing a young boy who was unmistakably me at about age 7. I recognized my face immediately, the same cowlick that never stayed down, the same crooked smile, the same blue jacket that I remembered wearing constantly during second grade, but the background of the photo was completely unfamiliar. The boy, who was clearly me, was standing in front of what appeared to be a large Victorian house with elaborate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch decorated with hanging flower baskets. Behind the house, I could see rolling hills covered with pine trees and what looked like a lake or large pond in the distance. It was a beautiful setting, the kind of place you'd want to visit on vacation, but I had absolutely no memory of ever being there. I called my grandmother over and showed her the photograph. Grandma, when was this taken? She put on her reading glasses and studied the photo carefully, her expression growing puzzled. That's definitely you, honey. You must have been about 7 years old, but I have no idea where this was taken. I examined the photo more closely, looking for any clues that might help me identify the location or circumstances. I was wearing clothes, I remembered, not just the blue jacket, but also a striped shirt and jeans that had been favorites during that period of my childhood. My hair was cut in the style my mother had always insisted on, and I even recognized a small bandage on my left hand from when I'd scraped it on my bicycle during the summer I turned 7. But despite these familiar details, the setting remained completely foreign to me. The Victorian house was distinctive and beautiful, with architectural details that should have made it memorable if I'd ever seen it before. The landscape behind it was equally striking. Those rolling hills and the distant water created a scenic view that seemed like it should have left a lasting impression on a 7-year-old child. I asked my grandmother if she recognized the handwriting on the back of the photo, but there was nothing written there, just the standard processing marks from whatever photo lab had developed it. The photo paper looked like it was from the right time period, with the slightly glossy finish and color saturation typical of 1980s film processing. When my mother came by later that afternoon to help with the packing, I showed her the mysterious photograph. Her reaction was even more perplexing than my grandmother's had been. She stared at the image for a long time, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been concern. "This is definitely you," she said finally. "I remember that jacket, and that's exactly how you looked when you were 7, but I have no idea when or where this was taken." I pressed her for more details about our family trips and visits during that period of my childhood. We'd spent most of my early years in suburban Detroit, with occasional visits to my grandparents' house in Ohio and a few camping trips to state parks in Michigan. None of our family vacation destinations had featured Victorian houses or scenic lake views like the ones in the photograph. I asked. My mother shook her head. "You were only 7. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with identifying the location in the photograph. I scanned the image and used reverse image search tools to see if I could find similar Victorian houses or landscapes online. I posted in local history groups and photography forums, asking if anyone could identify the architecture or geographical features visible in the background. Several people suggested that the house looked like examples of Victorian architecture common in certain regions, the Pacific Northwest, parts of New England, or some areas of the Great Lakes. But none of the specific locations they proposed matched exactly, and none of them were places my family had any connection to during my childhood. I also tried to trace the photo's history. I asked my grandmother when she might have acquired it, whether it had been given to her by other family members, or if it had come from somewhere else. But she had no memory of receiving it, and she was certain it had been in that shoebox for many years, mixed in with other family photos from the same time period. The mystery deepened when I found a second photograph tucked between the pages of an old photo album. This one showed the same Victorian house from a different angle, with what appeared to be the same 7-year-old version of me standing on the wraparound porch. In this photo, I was holding what looked like an ice cream cone and smiling directly at the camera, clearly enjoying whatever outing had brought me to this mysterious location. I enlisted my sister's help in trying to solve the puzzle. She's 3 years older than I am and has always had a better memory for childhood events. But when I showed her the photographs, she was as baffled as everyone else. She remembered the clothes I was wearing, confirmed that the photos were definitely taken during the right time period, but had no recollection of ever visiting the location shown in the images. It's like you were living a parallel life that none of us knew about, she said, which was an uncomfortably accurate description of how the photographs made me feel. I decided to hire a private investigator who specialized in genealogical research, thinking that maybe the Victorian house was connected to some branch of our family history that I wasn't aware of. I provided him with the photographs and asked him to try to identify the location and any possible family connections. 3 weeks later, he called with results that were both fascinating and disturbing. He'd managed to identify the house in the photographs. It was a bed and breakfast called Hillcrest Manor in a small town in Vermont called Millfield. The house had been built in 1887 and had been operating as a tourist accommodation since the 1960s. But here's what made his discovery so unsettling. According to the guest registers he'd examined, no one with our family name had ever stayed there. I drove to Vermont the following weekend to see Hillcrest Manor in person. The house was exactly as it appeared in the photographs. Same gingerbread trim, same wraparound porch, same scenic setting overlooking a valley with a lake in the distance. The current owners were friendly and helpful, allowing me to take photos from the same angles and even letting me examine their old guest books and photo albums. But there was no record of my family ever visiting Hillcrest Manor, and none of the longtime staff members recognized me or had any memory of a family with a 7-year-old boy matching my description. The owners showed me photographs from the 1980s of other guests who had stayed at the bed and breakfast, but I wasn't in any of them. Standing on the porch of Hillcrest Manor, holding the mysterious photographs of my younger self, I felt like I was confronting evidence of a childhood experience that had somehow been erased from my memory and from all records of my family's history. The physical evidence was undeniable. Those were definitely photographs of me at age 7, taken at this exact location. But the circumstances of how I came to be here, who brought me, and why no one remembered the trip remained completely unexplained. I've kept those photographs on my desk for the past 9 months, looking at them regularly and trying to trigger any suppressed memories of visiting Vermont as a child. I've researched dissociative amnesia, childhood trauma, and various psychological conditions that might explain why I could have completely forgotten what appeared to be a significant family trip. But the memories never come. That 7-year-old boy in the photographs looks happy and relaxed, clearly enjoying his visit to this beautiful place. There's no indication of distress or trauma that might explain why the experience was forgotten. He looks like a normal child having a normal vacation, documenting a normal family outing. Yet somehow, that normal family outing has been completely erased from the collective memory of everyone who should have been involved. I exist in those photographs as proof that I was there, but I'm the only evidence that the trip ever happened. It's as if some version of my childhood included experiences that the current version of my life has no access to. Memories that belong to a parallel existence I can observe but not recall. Sometimes I wonder if there are other photographs out there, other documentation of childhood experiences I've forgotten, other evidence of a life I lived but can't remember. The boy in those Vermont photographs looks like he's having wonderful adventures, visiting beautiful places, creating memories that should have lasted a lifetime. Instead, those memories exist only in faded color photographs found in an attic shoebox, offering glimpses of a childhood that feels simultaneously familiar and impossible, documenting experiences that shaped a version of me I can see but can never quite reach. We'd lived in the house for 3 years before we ever needed to use the storm shelter. It was one of those underground concrete bunkers that are common in tornado country, built by the previous owners sometime in the 1980s and accessed through a heavy steel door set into a small concrete mound in our backyard. When we first moved in, my wife Janet had insisted on checking it out, but we'd found it empty except for some old folding chairs and a musty smell that suggested it hadn't been opened in years. The door had always been easy to open, just a simple handle that lifted a basic latch mechanism. No lock, no complicated hardware, just the kind of straightforward access you'd want during a weather emergency when every second counts. We'd left it unlocked deliberately, figuring that if we ever needed shelter from a tornado, we wouldn't want to waste time fumbling with keys or combinations. The storm that changed everything hit on a Tuesday night in late April. The sirens started wailing around 10 p.m., and the local weather service was reporting rotation in a cell that was heading directly toward our neighborhood. Janet and I grabbed our emergency kit and flashlights and ran for the shelter, expecting to spend an uncomfortable but safe hour underground while the storm passed over. That's when we discovered that the door wouldn't open. I pulled the handle repeatedly, thinking at first that it might be stuck due to weather or seasonal settling. But it wasn't just stuck, it was completely immovable, as if it were being held shut from the inside by someone or something with considerable strength. The handle moved freely, indicating that the mechanism wasn't broken, but the door itself wouldn't budge even a fraction of an inch. Janet and I both tried pulling together, putting our combined weight into the effort, but we might as well have been trying to lift the concrete bunker itself. The door was definitely being held closed, and whatever was holding it was stronger than both of us, pulling as hard as we could. With the tornado sirens still wailing and rotation confirmed on the ground just a few miles away, we had to abandon our attempts to reach the shelter and take cover in our basement instead. We huddled in the interior corner with a mattress over our heads while the storm passed directly over our house, bringing straight-line winds that knocked down trees and damaged roofs throughout the neighborhood. We were fortunate that no tornado actually touched down in our immediate area, but it was terrifying to be stuck above ground when we should have been safely underground. The next morning, after the all clear had been issued and we'd assessed the minor damage to our property, I went back to examine the storm shelter door. To my complete amazement, it opened easily, the same effortless lift of the handle that I remembered from our previous inspections. There was no sign of damage to the mechanism, no indication of what might have prevented it from opening during the storm. I climbed down into the shelter to look for any explanation of what had happened. The interior was exactly as we'd left it, empty except for the old folding chairs, with no signs that anyone or anything had been inside. The walls were solid concrete with no other exits, and the floor was undisturbed. But something had definitely been holding that door closed from the inside during the storm. Janet suggested that maybe the atmospheric pressure changes during severe weather had somehow affected the door mechanism, creating a vacuum effect that made it impossible to open from the outside. It sounded plausible, and I wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something more intentional than a meteorological anomaly. A month later, we had another severe weather event. This time, I was prepared to document what happened with the shelter door. When the tornado sirens activated, I went straight to the backyard with my phone ready to record, determined to capture evidence of whatever was preventing us from accessing our emergency shelter. Once again, the door was locked from the inside. I filmed myself attempting to open it, demonstrating that the handle moved freely, but the door remained immovable. I could hear Janet calling from the house, urging me to come inside and take cover in the basement, but I was determined to understand what was happening with our shelter. As I stood there pulling on the door handle, I became aware of sounds coming from inside the bunker. Not mechanical sounds that might indicate equipment malfunction, but what sounded like movement, footsteps perhaps, or the scraping of objects being moved around. The sounds were faint, but definitely present, audible even over the wind and rain from the approaching storm. I put my ear against the steel door and listened more carefully. The sounds from inside were rhythmic and purposeful, like someone pacing back and forth in the confined space of the shelter. But that was impossible. There was no other way into the bunker, and we'd checked it just days earlier and found it empty. I started knocking on the door, calling out to whoever might be inside. "Hello? Is someone in there?" But the sounds stopped immediately, as if whatever was making them had suddenly become aware of my presence and decided to remain silent. The storm passed without serious damage to our area, and the next morning I found the shelter door open and accessible once again. This time, I examined the interior much more carefully, looking for any sign that someone had been inside during the storm. What I found was disturbing in its subtlety. The folding chairs, which had always been arranged randomly against one wall, were now neatly positioned in a circle in the center of the shelter. The dust patterns on the floor showed clear evidence of recent disturbance, with what looked like footprints leading around the perimeter of the small space. Most unsettling was a section of the concrete wall that appeared to have been cleaned recently, as if someone had scrubbed away dirt and grime to reveal fresh surface underneath. I installed a security camera in the shelter, positioned to record whatever might be happening inside during severe weather events. The camera was motion activated and battery powered, designed to operate independently of our home's electrical system. I tested it thoroughly and confirmed that it could record in the low-light conditions of the underground bunker. The next tornado warning came in the early June. As expected, the shelter door was locked from the inside when we tried to access it, but this time I had documentation of what was happening inside the bunker, or at least, I should have had documentation. When I reviewed the camera footage the next day, I found 12 hours of recording that showed absolutely nothing. The shelter appeared to be empty throughout the entire storm event, with no movement, no activity, nothing that could explain the sounds I'd heard or the door being held closed. Yet the door had definitely been immovable during the storm, and I definitely heard sounds of movement from inside. The camera had functioned perfectly, recording clear footage of the empty shelter before and after the storm. But during the hours when the door was locked and I'd heard sounds from inside, the footage showed only an empty concrete room with undisturbed chairs and no signs of any presence whatsoever. I started researching the history of our property, thinking that maybe there was something about the shelter or the land that might explain these strange occurrences. What I discovered was troubling, but not entirely surprising. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Brennan, had died during a tornado in 1987, not in the shelter, but in his house, which had been partially destroyed when he'd been unable to reach the underground bunker in time. According to newspaper reports from the time, Mr. Brennan had built the shelter specifically because he'd survived a previous tornado that had destroyed his first house on the same property in 1965. He'd been obsessed with tornado safety, constantly monitoring weather reports and maintaining his shelter in perfect condition. But on the night he died, neighbors reported that they'd seen him trying desperately to open the shelter door as the tornado approached, unable to access the safety he'd spent years preparing for. I began to suspect that whatever was preventing us from using the shelter during storms was somehow connected to Harold Brennan's tragic death. Perhaps his spirit was still trying to use the shelter he'd built, claiming the space during tornado warnings and preventing the living from accessing it. It sounded like something from a ghost story, but I couldn't think of any other explanation that accounted for all the evidence. We moved out of the house last month, partly because of job relocation, but also because we could never feel safe during severe weather events. The idea of having an emergency shelter that became inaccessible during emergencies was more than just inconvenient. It was genuinely dangerous. If a tornado had actually touched down in our neighborhood, we could have been killed while standing outside a shelter that was being occupied by someone who was already dead. The new owners are a young couple with small children, and I felt obligated to warn them about the shelter's strange behavior during storms. They listened politely, but obviously thought I was either lying or delusional. I gave them copies of my videos and photos, but I doubt they'll believe the evidence until they experience a tornado, warning themselves, and find that their emergency shelter has been claimed by a previous resident who's still trying to survive storms that ended decades ago. I hope they never have to find out what it feels like to stand in their backyard during a tornado warning, pulling frantically on a door that won't open, listening to the sounds of movement from inside a shelter that's supposed to be empty, knowing that their safety is being denied by someone who learned too late that some forms of protection can't extend beyond the grave. The storm shelter is still there, still waiting for the next severe weather event, still holding its secrets in the darkness underground. And somewhere in that concrete bunker, Harold Brennan is still preparing for the tornado that took his life, still claiming the safety he built for himself, still preventing others from accessing the protection he could never reach when he needed it most. We bought the house in November, moving in just before the first snow of what would turn out to be a particularly harsh Minnesota winter. It was a 1950s ranch style home in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, the kind of solid, unpretentious place that appealed to us as first time homeowners. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years before moving to a retirement community, and they'd left behind the usual remnants of a long occupancy, a few pieces of furniture we'd agreed to take, some gardening tools in the garage, and various electronic devices that were too outdated to be worth moving. Among the items they'd left was an old baby monitor sitting on a shelf in what had clearly been a child's bedroom. It was the kind with a simple base station and a portable receiver, probably from the 1990s based on the design and the fact that it used rechargeable batteries that were long dead. Sarah and I laughed about it when we found it, joking about the optimism of leaving baby gear for a couple in their 30s who had never expressed any interest in having children. We tossed the monitor into a box with other miscellaneous items that we planned to donate to charity, but somehow it never made it out of the house. The box sat in our bedroom closet for weeks, and eventually we forgot about its contents entirely. Life got busy with the process of settling into a new home, new jobs, and the social dynamics of a new neighborhood. It was sometime in January when we first heard the voice. I was working late in my home office, catching up on some freelance projects, when I heard what sounded like a child talking somewhere in the house. It was faint and indistinct, just murmured conversation that seemed to be coming from the directions of our bedroom. I assumed Sarah was watching television or talking on the phone, so I didn't investigate immediately. But when Sarah came into my office a few minutes later to say goodnight, I realized she'd been in the kitchen for the past hour, nowhere near our bedroom. When I mentioned hearing voices, she looked puzzled and said she hadn't heard anything unusual. We walked through the house together, checking each room for any source of the voices I'd heard. All the televisions were off, no radios were playing, and our neighbors' houses were too far away for us to hear conversations through the walls. Eventually, we decided I'd probably heard something from outside, maybe people walking by on the sidewalk or the sound carrying strangely through the winter air. 3 nights later, Sarah woke me up around 2 a.m., shaking my shoulder gently but insistently. She whispered. I lay still and listened. From somewhere in the house came the soft sound of a child's voice, speaking in the kind of sing-song rhythm that children use when they're playing alone or talking to themselves. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably that of a young child, maybe 3 or 4 years old. We got up and followed the sound through the house, and it led us to our bedroom closet. The voice was definitely coming from inside the closet, from the direction of the box we'd never gotten around to donating. When I opened the closet door and moved some clothes aside, the talking stopped immediately. I pulled out the box and found the old baby monitor. The receiver was sitting on top, and its power light was glowing green despite the fact that we'd never plugged it in or charged the supposedly dead batteries. When I picked up the receiver, it was warm to the touch, as if it had been operating for hours. "That's impossible," Sarah said, examining the device. I checked the base station, which we found still wrapped in the original packaging at the bottom of the box. It wasn't plugged into anything, had no batteries installed, and showed no signs of having been activated. Yet somehow, the receiver had been operating and picking up transmissions from somewhere. We spent the next hour trying to figure out how the monitor could have been working. I tested various combinations of settings and frequencies, thinking maybe it was picking up signals from baby monitors in neighboring houses. But the houses in our neighborhood were too far apart for that kind of interference, and when I scanned through all the available channels, I found only static. Sarah suggested we just get rid of the monitor, donate it along with the other items we'd been meaning to clear out. But I was genuinely curious about what we'd heard and how a supposedly non-functional device had been producing clear audio signals. I convinced her to let me keep it for a few days while I researched baby monitor frequencies and potential sources of interference. I set up the receiver on my desk in the home office, positioning it where I could monitor it while I worked. For 2 days, it remained silent, just a plastic device with a glowing power light, showing no signs of the mysterious transmissions we'd heard earlier. On the third night, the voice came back. I was reading in bed around 11 p.m. when I heard the familiar sound of a child talking from the direction of my office. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a digital recorder and hurried to the desk where I'd left the baby monitor receiver. The child's voice was clear and distinct, coming through the monitor's speaker with the kind of clarity that suggested the transmission source was very close by. But what I heard made my hands shake as I held the recorder. "Mommy said not to go outside when it's dark," the voice said in the matter-of-fact tone that children use when reciting rules they've been taught. "But I can see the lights in the backyard." I looked out my office window toward our backyard, but it was dark except for the occasional streetlight glow filtering through bare winter trees. There were no lights moving around, no signs of anything that a child might find interesting enough to watch. The voice continued. "Daddy is sleeping in the big chair again. He always sleeps there now." I recorded nearly 10 minutes of similar observations, a child's commentary on what appeared to be their daily life, delivered in the kind of stream of consciousness way that young children talk when they're processing their experiences out loud. The child described family routines, discussed toys and games, and occasionally asked questions as if they were talking to an adult who was present but whose responses weren't picked up by the monitor. When the transmission finally ended, I played back my recording for Sarah. The quality was clear enough that we could make out every word, and the voice was definitely that of a young child, probably a girl, based on the pitch and intonation. Sarah asked. I'd been wondering the same thing. We knew most of our immediate neighbors, and none of them had children young enough to match the voice we were hearing. The houses on either side of us were occupied by couples in their 60s, and the family across the street had teenagers, not preschoolers. Over the following weeks, the transmissions became more frequent and more detailed. Almost every night, we'd hear the child's voice coming through the baby monitor, describing activities and interactions that painted a picture of a family life that seemed both normal and somehow troubled. The child often mentioned parents who who seemed to be having difficulties, a father who slept in chairs instead of beds, a mother who cried when she thought no one was looking, arguments that happened after bedtime when the child was supposed to be asleep. The observations were delivered without judgment or apparent understanding of their significance, just a child's honest reporting of the adult world they were witnessing. What made these transmissions particularly unsettling was their consistency. The child described the same house layout that matched our own home, mentioned looking out windows that corresponded to the windows in our house, and referred to rooms and features that suggested they were living in the same physical space we occupied. But the family life being described was clearly different from our own. The child talked about furniture we didn't have, mentioned family pets we'd never owned, and described daily routines that didn't match anything Sarah and I had ever experienced in the house. I started researching the history of our home, thinking that maybe the transmissions were somehow connected to previous occupants. What I learned from neighbors and public records was troubling but not entirely surprising. In the late 1980s, the house had been occupied by a young family, parents in their 30s, with a 4-year-old daughter named Emma. The family had experienced a series of tragic events during their time in the house. The father had lost his job and had struggled with depression and alcohol abuse. The mother had been overwhelmed by financial stress and the responsibility of caring for both her husband and her daughter. The situation had culminated in a murder-suicide in January 1989. The father had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life, all of them found in the house by concerned neighbors who hadn't seen the family for several days. The elderly couple we'd bought the house from had purchased it from the bank a year after the tragedy, living there peacefully for 4 decades without ever reporting any unusual experiences. But they'd kept the child's bedroom largely unchanged, maintaining it as a guest room but preserving many of the original features that had been there when Emma lived in the house. I realized that the voice coming through the baby monitor was describing the final weeks of Emma's life, transmitting across more than 30 years to document the decline of a family that had ended in tragedy. The observations about her father sleeping in chairs, her mother crying, the arguments after bedtime, all of it was the innocent perspective of a child who was witnessing the disintegration of her world without understanding what it meant. We stopped listening to the monitor after that, packing it away in the garage where we couldn't hear its nightly transmissions. But sometimes, late at night when the house is particularly quiet, I can still hear the faint sound of a child's voice coming from somewhere in the walls, still describing the lights in the backyard, still asking questions that will never be answered, still documenting a family life that ended decades ago, but somehow continues to broadcast its final moments to anyone willing to listen. The baby monitor is still in our garage, probably still receiving transmissions from a time when Emma was alive and unaware that her observations were being recorded for posterity. We don't have a baby, but we live in a house where a child's voice still echoes through electronic devices, still trying to make sense of a world that was falling apart around her, still broadcasting her innocence into a future where her story serves as a reminder that some tragedies leave echoes that persist long after the original sounds have faded away. I'd been working as a seasonal fire spotter for the Forest Service for 3 summers, spending my days in remote lookout towers, scanning the horizon for smoke plumes and radio coordinates to dispatch teams. It was solitary work that suited my temperament, and I'd grown comfortable with the isolation and the long hours of vigilant observation. What happened during my assignment to the Bear Creek Tower in August 2022 challenged my understanding of what kinds of threats a fire lookout might encounter in the wilderness. Bear Creek Tower sits on a ridge in the Cascade Range, about 40 miles southeast of Bend, Oregon. It's one of the more remote stations in the district, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that takes nearly 2 hours to navigate from the nearest paved highway. The tower itself is a classic design from the 1950s, a small cabin mounted on steel legs about 60 feet above the forest floor, with windows on all 4 sides, providing a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. I'd been assigned to Bear Creek for a 2-week rotation, relieving another spotter who'd requested an early transfer back to civilization. I didn't think much of it. Some people aren't cut out for the solitude that comes with fire tower duty. The first few days at Bear Creek were routine. The weather was dry and clear, perfect fire conditions that required constant vigilance. I spent my days scanning the forest with binoculars, monitoring weather instruments, and filing regular reports with the district office. The nights were peaceful, filled with the usual sounds of wilderness life: owls calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes somewhere in the valleys below. It was on my 4th night that I first noticed something unusual. I was lying in the narrow bunk that served as the tower's sleeping quarters when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the metal platform that surrounded the cabin. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that circled the tower slowly and methodically. My first thought was that someone had climbed up to visit, maybe a lost hiker or another Forest Service employee checking on the station. I got up and looked out the windows, but I couldn't see anyone on the platform. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see clearly, and the metal walkway was empty. But the footsteps continued, moving around the cabin with a steady rhythm that suggested someone was walking the perimeter of the platform over and over. I called out, identifying myself as Forest Service personnel and asking if anyone needed assistance. The footsteps stopped immediately, but no one answered. I waited at the window for several minutes, watching for any sign of movement, but the platform remained empty. Eventually, the footsteps resumed, continuing their slow circuit around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. The platform was definitely empty. No one was there. No signs that anyone had been there. But as I stood in the doorway, I could still hear the footsteps continuing around the tower, always just out of sight around the corner of the cabin. When I walked to where the sounds were coming from, they would shift to a different part of the platform, as if whatever was making them was deliberately staying out of view. I spent an hour trying to locate the source of the footsteps, but I never saw anything that could account for the sounds. Eventually, I went back inside and tried to sleep, but the footsteps continued until dawn, circling the tower with mechanical persistence. The next morning, I examined the platform carefully, looking for any evidence of what might have been walking around the cabin during the night. The metal walkway showed no footprints or scuff marks, no signs of disturbance. I checked the tower's support structure, thinking that maybe thermal expansion or wind stress was causing the metal to creak in a way that sounded like footsteps. But the tower was solid and stable, with no obvious source for the sounds I'd heard. I called the district office and reported the incident, describing it as possible wildlife activity or structural settling that was causing unusual noises. The supervisor I spoke with didn't seem surprised by my report, noting it in the station log and suggesting that I keep detailed records of any unusual observations. The second night of footsteps was more disturbing than the first. The sounds began earlier, just after sunset, and they were louder and more aggressive. Instead of the steady walking pace I'd heard the night before, the footsteps had an urgent, agitated quality, as if whatever was making them was angry or frustrated. I tried to observe from inside the cabin, positioning myself at different windows to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was circling the tower. But every time I thought I might see something, the sounds would shift to a different side of the platform. It was as if the thing making the footsteps was aware of my position and was deliberately avoiding my line of sight. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped at what I estimated was the north side of the platform. For several minutes, there was a complete silence. Then I heard what sounded like scratching or scraping against the cabin wall, as if something with claws was testing the strength of the wooden siding. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact the district office, but the signal was weak and filled with static. Remote fire towers often have communication problems at night due to atmospheric conditions, so I wasn't immediately concerned about the radio failure. But the timing felt ominous, as if whatever was outside the cabin was somehow interfering with my ability to call for help. The scratching sounds continued for about 10 minutes, moving around the cabin and occasionally pausing at the windows. I could hear what sounded like breathing just outside the glass, heavy and rhythmic. But when I looked out, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint shapes of distant trees. On the third night, I was prepared. I'd positioned cameras at several windows, set up motion-activated recording equipment, and prepared detailed documentation of everything I was experiencing. If something was circling the tower, I was determined to capture evidence of what it was. The footsteps began just after 8 p.m., but this time they were accompanied by other sounds, low vocalizations that sounded almost human, but with an odd quality that made them deeply unsettling. The sounds were like someone trying to speak, but having difficulty forming words, creating a mixture of growls and syllables that occasionally resembled human speech. I reviewed the recordings the next morning, but the audio was strangely distorted. The footsteps were clearly audible, but they sounded hollow and echoing, as if they were being made by something much larger and heavier than human feet. The vocalizations were even more disturbing on playback. They definitely contained elements of human speech, but stretched and modified in ways that made them sound like recordings played at the wrong speed. The video footage was even more puzzling. The cameras clearly showed the empty platform throughout the night, but the audio track recorded the footsteps and vocalizations with perfect clarity. Whatever was circling the tower was making real sounds that could be recorded, but it wasn't visible to electronic sensors. By the fourth night, I was seriously considering abandoning my assignment and returning to the district office. But I'd committed to a 2-week rotation, and I was reluctant to leave my post without a better understanding of what was happening. I decided to try a more direct approach. When the footsteps began that evening, I went outside with a powerful spotlight and positioned myself in the center of the platform. Instead of trying to chase the sounds around the tower, I stood still and waited for whatever was making them to come to me. The footsteps continued circling, but they gradually moved closer to where I was standing. I could hear them clearly now, heavy impacts on the metal walkway that made the entire platform vibrate slightly. But my spotlight revealed nothing, just empty space where the sounds indicated something large should have been walking. Then the footsteps stopped directly in front of me, maybe 3 feet away. I could hear breathing, heavy and labored, and I could feel warm air moving past my face, as if something large was exhaling in my direction. But there was nothing there, nothing visible, nothing that cast a shadow, nothing that my spotlight could illuminate. I spoke to whatever was standing in front of me, identifying myself and asking what it wanted. The breathing stopped, and for a moment there was a complete silence. Then I heard a voice, low and raspy, speaking words that sounded like English but were difficult to understand. Watch, it said, each word separated by long pauses, as if speaking required enormous effort. Always, watching, never. I asked what it meant, but the presence had moved away. The footsteps resumed their circuit around the tower, and the voice didn't speak again that night. I completed my 2-week assignment at Bear Creek Tower, documenting each night's encounters with whatever entity was circling the station. The pattern never varied, footsteps beginning at sunset, continuing until dawn, occasionally accompanied by vocalizations or the sound of scratching on the cabin walls. But I never saw anything that could account for the phenomena, despite constant observation and multiple recording devices. When I returned to the district office, I filed a detailed report of my experiences, including audio recordings and suggestions for further investigation. The supervisor who reviewed my report wasn't surprised by its contents, noting that Bear Creek Tower had a long history of unusual incidents reported by fire spotters. He showed me a file containing similar reports dating back to the 1960s, multiple accounts of footsteps circling the tower, vocalizations that sounded almost human, and the consistent sense that something was keeping watch over the fire station. Several spotters had requested early transfers, and a few had abandoned their posts entirely rather than spend another night in the tower. I learned that the Bear Creek area had been the site of a major forest fire in 1953, before the current tower was built. A fire spotter named William Hendricks had died in that fire, refusing to abandon his post despite evacuation orders. His body had been found in the burned remains of the original tower, still at his observation post, still trying to radio coordinates of the fire's progress. The supervisor suggested that what I'd encountered might be Hendrix's spirit, still maintaining his vigil, still watching for fires that threatened the forest he'd died protecting. It sounded like folklore, but it was the only explanation that accounted for the consistency of reports over 6 decades. I never requested another assignment to Bear Creek Tower, but I think about those nights often. Somewhere in the Cascade Range, 60 feet above the forest floor, something continues to circle a fire lookout tower, keeping watch over wilderness that it's been protecting for over 70 years. The entity that died at his post in 1953 is still on duty, still scanning the horizon for smoke, still maintaining the vigil that cost him his life but earned him a kind of immortality. Fire spotters are taught to watch for threats that might endanger the forest, but they're not prepared for the possibility that the forest itself might be watched over by guardians who refuse to abandon their posts even in death. Bear Creek Tower is never truly unmanned. It's always under observation by someone who understands better than anyone the importance of constant vigilance in protecting the wilderness from the fires that can destroy it in a matter of hours. I was flying from Phoenix to Seattle on what should have been a routine 2-hour flight, seated in 14A with my laptop open, working on a presentation for a Monday morning meeting. It was a clear Thursday evening in March, the kind of perfect flying weather that makes air travel feel almost boring in its predictability. I'd made this same trip dozens of times for work, and I barely looked up from my screen when the pilot announced we were beginning our descent into Seattle-Tacoma International. That's when I noticed we were flying over terrain that didn't look right for the approach to SeaTac. Instead of the familiar urban sprawl of the Puget Sound region, I was looking down at what appeared to be vast stretches of desert broken by geometric patterns that looked too regular to be natural formations. Perfect circles, straight lines extending for miles, and rectangular shapes that suggested massive construction projects in the middle of nowhere. I'd never seen anything like it during previous flights into Seattle. I checked my phone's GPS, but we were flying too high for it to get a reliable signal. The woman in the seat next to me was also looking out the window with a puzzled expression, and across the aisle, a man was taking photos of the landscape below with his phone camera. "This doesn't look like Washington State," the woman said quietly. I agreed, but before I could respond, the pilot's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that immediately got everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been rerouted due to temporary air traffic control restrictions in our original flight path. We're currently flying over a special use airspace area, and I need to ask that all passengers please close window shades and refrain from taking photographs until we've cleared this region. This is a federal requirement, and flight attendants will be coming through to ensure compliance." The pilot's tone was different from the usual professional calm. There was an undertone of tension that suggested this wasn't a routine rerouting. Flight attendants immediately began moving through the cabin, politely but firmly asking passengers to lower their window shades and put away cameras. When the man across the aisle protested that he was just taking pictures of scenery, the flight attendant's response was unusually stern. "Sir, photography is strictly prohibited over this airspace." I lowered my shade as requested, but not before taking one more look at the landscape below. What I saw in those final seconds was even more unusual than the geometric patterns I'd noticed earlier. There were structures down there, large white buildings, arranged in perfect grids, connected by roads that formed geometric patterns across the desert floor. Some of the buildings were enormous, hangar-sized structures that dwarfed anything I'd ever seen from commercial aircraft. The most unsettling detail was the complete absence of normal infrastructure. No towns, no highways leading to the facility, no power lines or communication towers. Whatever was down there existed in complete isolation, hidden in what appeared to be hundreds of square miles of empty desert. For the next 20 minutes, we flew with all window shades closed, the cabin filled with an unusual tension as passengers murmured quietly about what they'd seen. The flight attendants remained unusually vigilant, occasionally walking the aisles to ensure that shades stayed down and that no one was using electronic devices to record anything. When we were finally allowed to raise the shades, we were flying over familiar Pacific Northwest terrain, the forests and mountains that surround Seattle, the urban development that marks the approach to SeaTac. It was as if we'd somehow jumped from the desert Southwest directly to Washington State, skipping over everything that should have been in between. After we landed, I tried to research our flight path using online tracking services. According to Flight Radar 24 and similar sites, our flight had followed a completely normal route from Phoenix to Seattle, with no detours or deviations from the standard flight plan. The tracking data showed a straight line from departure to arrival, with no indication that we'd flown over any unusual territory. But I knew what I'd seen, and judging by the conversations I overheard while waiting for baggage claim, other passengers had seen the same things. Several people were discussing the geometric patterns in the desert, the unusual buildings, and the pilot's strange announcement about restricted airspace. I tried to identify what we'd flown over by studying maps of military installations and restricted areas in the western United States. There are several well-known sites: Area 51 in Nevada, White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, various testing facilities scattered across the desert states. But none of them matched the scale or configuration of what I'd observed from the aircraft. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with trying to understand what we'd been shown during that detour. I researched commercial flight paths, military airspace restrictions, and various conspiracy theories about secret government facilities. What I discovered was a pattern of similar incidents reported by other passengers on flights across the western United States. Online forums contained scattered accounts of commercial flights being rerouted over mysterious desert installations, always with the same pattern. Passengers were allowed to observe for a few minutes before being ordered to close window shades and stop taking photographs. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: geometric patterns, large white buildings, isolated facilities with no apparent connection to normal infrastructure. Most disturbing were the accounts from passengers who had attempted to photograph or video these facilities. Several reported that their electronic devices malfunctioned during the flights, with cameras failing to record or images becoming corrupted. Others said that airport security had approached them after landing and requested that they delete any photos taken during the flight. I tried to contact other passengers from my flight to compare notes about what we'd experienced. Using the airline's customer service system, I was able to reach a few people who had been on the same flight. Their accounts matched mine perfectly: the desert landscape, the geometric patterns, the unusual buildings, and the pilot's announcement about restricted airspace. But when I tried to follow up with these passengers a few weeks later, I discovered something unsettling. Several of them claimed to have no memory of any detour or unusual landscape during the flight. When I described what we'd seen together, they insisted that the flight had been completely routine, with no deviations from the normal Phoenix to Seattle route. One woman, who had been sitting next to me and had clearly been disturbed by what she'd seen, became hostile when I brought up the subject, accusing me of trying to involve her in some kind of conspiracy theory. A man who had been taking photographs and had argued with the flight attendant claimed that nothing unusual had happened during the flight and that I must be confusing him with someone else. It was as if their memories of the event had been selectively edited, leaving them with recollections of a normal, uneventful flight, while I retained clear memories of the detour and everything we'd observed during those 20 minutes over restricted airspace. I've made the same Phoenix to Seattle flight several times since then, always hoping to experience another detour that might provide additional clues about what we'd been shown. But every subsequent flight has followed the normal route, with no deviations, no mysterious announcements, and no glimpses of secret installations hidden in the desert. I've come to believe that what we experienced wasn't an accidental rerouting due to air traffic control restrictions. It was a deliberate exposure, a carefully orchestrated glimpse of facilities that exist beyond public knowledge or oversight. Perhaps it was a test of some kind, or a way of gradually acclimating the population to the existence of projects that operate outside normal governmental transparency. The fact that most passengers' memories of the event were apparently altered or suppressed suggests a level of capability that extends far beyond simple military secrecy. Whatever organization operates those desert facilities possesses technology that can selectively modify human memory, leaving only certain individuals with clear recollections of what they've witnessed. I don't know why I was allowed to retain my memories while others were not, but I suspect it wasn't random. Perhaps some people are chosen to remember, to serve as witnesses who can gradually spread awareness of these hidden projects through careful sharing of their experiences. Or perhaps the memory modification process isn't perfect, and a small percentage of observers inevitably slip through the cracks. The desert installations are still out there, still operating in complete secrecy, still occasionally revealing themselves to commercial airline passengers who find themselves flying over restricted airspace that officially doesn't exist. And somewhere in the bureaucracy that manages these exposures, decisions are being made about who gets to remember what they've seen and who has their memories carefully edited to preserve the illusion that such places exist only in the realm of speculation and conspiracy theory. I'll never know for certain what I was shown during those 20 minutes over the desert, but I know that it represented technology and organizational capability that exists far beyond anything we're supposed to be aware of. The question isn't whether secret projects operate in hidden facilities. It's how many of us have been shown evidence of their existence and then had our memories altered to protect secrets that are too important to remain completely hidden but too sensitive to be fully revealed.